encompasses 424 acres and contains about 1,137 million gallons of water, and the deepest point measures 52 feet. There's no public access, but there are 2 private access sites, one at Lake Pleasant Marine and another at Manipogo Campground. Our past president, Janet Boney, discovered an interesting fact from the World on the Map website. Our little lake is a registered place for seaplanes to land. Now we can assume that that's because it's a long lake and because a former resident, Dr. Chupp, used to land his seaplane here. We're leaving today from an area called Pleasant Shores on the northeast end of the lake, from that empty lot down there next to the brown cottage. That's where it begins. And it goes all the way to around the bend up here. I'll have to point out the end of Pleasant Shores when we get there because it's quite a little ways. Okay, in 1837, President Martin Van Buren authorized the sale of over 154 acres to William Martin. He retained ownership of this area till 1910 and then sold a parcel or left the parcel to his son, Robert, who in turn had the area along the northeast shore, Lane 101, platted into 16 lots. All 16 lots were sold, with the majority of the homes built in the 1970s and later. So this is actually the newest development on the lake. During the early periods of development, the roads were so poorly defined that they contributed to kind of a humorous story from Phil Husband, who actually owns that place right there with the peak. The kind of yellowish colored house over there, kind of beige. The gray one with the peak in it. Okay. He said that he had ordered a load of drywall when he was building his place, and he ordered it from the lumber yard in Angola to be delivered on a Saturday morning. He waited and he waited, no drywall. And in that day there weren't any cell phones, and he had to go clear to a payphone on a drive that went back to Barton Lake, all the way around over here to Barton Lake to call the lumber yard. After some polite discussion about the non-delivered goods, the lumber company told him that they had put the drywall in the garage of the house that was being constructed since it was open. However, they had delivered the drywall to the wrong place. It was somebody else's building, so I guess in retrospect it's funny, but it probably wasn't very funny to him at the time. So people along this lane used to have fun 4th of July parades. They dressed up crazily, put flags on lawnmowers, used horns and rattles to create a loud, festive spirit. Phil Husband tells about Vern Keese, who drove his four-wheeler with his wife wearing a very large long yellow t-shirt that said Vern's Girl on it. People from 450, which is that road over there on the east end, used to come and watch while other people blew their horns from the water with their boats. Now, I heard another story from him about Dewey's Dilly. Did anybody here know what Dewey's Dilly is? Or was? You ever hear of Dewey's Dilly? It's not really all that important. I just thought it was a funny nickname. And it was actually a cottage that was owned by the Dewey family just north of Olinger's place, which, so I assume it's the Brown house. It was the Brown house. They owned that cottage, and they used the lake a lot in the winter, which wasn't super common back then. And they had 4 or 5 kids, and they would race across the lake, four or five snowmobiles at a time. Today that might not seem odd, but back then it was pretty unusual, and they got a kick out of listening to the family enjoy the winter at the lake. You'll see some lots over here for sale. These sat empty and undeveloped for a long time, but finally the man who owned them decided to sell, and you can tell that the lake is still growing. We're still getting new people. Some of those lots sold this summer. Looks like there's some building going on back there now too. Okay. Anybody got any questions?
How many lots are left?
You know, I am not sure. Does anybody on the boat know how many lots are left?
2.
Just 2. Okay, there were quite a few. Were there like 10 in the beginning, I think?
There were 11.
11, yeah. Because I know I think of those houses down there as being new, but they really have been here like 15 years, somebody told me the other day. And we were renting back in the day, and seem like they're new to us. They seem new. They look new. I love this one. This is really pretty, this one. It's owned by a realtor. So we're going to be coming to the Sherman edition. I will show you the end of Pleasant Shores when we get around the bend. The Sherman edition, I actually never even knew was called the Sherman edition until we started researching for this program. We just learned that there was a name for it. And I'll talk about it when we get around the bend because I don't want to get ahead of myself here. You won't know what I'm talking about.
One of the original heirs of the original man who owned this is Linda Kring, and she lives at the very end of this road, back behind the woods. You can barely see her house.
Yeah, that's where we actually come to the end of Pleasant Shores, right?
That's where we come to the end of Pleasant
I didn't
Shores.
know that. That's interesting. So she was one of the heirs of the, she is one of the heirs of the original owner.
Of the original, well,
Which would have been the
the
Martin?
original Unruh. The
Okay,
original Unruh.
Unruh's.
She is a niece
Okay.
of Unruh's.
I know I've learned since we started this project that there's an amazing number of people on various locations that are related. Like, you know, so-and-so has a cottage and pretty soon their son or their brother, that's the case in my family. And I've heard other families say the same thing. You know, there's a family down in Sellers and then their kids bought one on the East End and then pretty soon. So it ends up being a great place for families to all enjoy the lake together. So here we are at the end of Pleasant Shores with the little cottage back. Look through the trees and you'll see it's kind of hidden back there. That belongs to the family member of the Unruhs that were here years ago. She's got a nice private location.
Right there, see it? Just
Okay, so here we come to the Sherman edition, and we have quite some humorous history on this development, I think, some of our more interesting facts. And this, we're getting into some originally older properties. In October of 1952, a member of the Ford family, which now still enjoys the lake, owned a car dealership. And another man desperately needed a beater car, just something to get him back and forth to work, and he traded his lake property over here for a car. And originally, the Ford started with a prefabricated building, relocated from Ball State University. We're going to see that. I'll point out the house to you in just a minute. It was part of the Ball State University's married housing units. And the walls were held together with steel cable, and there was no indoor plumbing. Fords hauled water from neighbors who had a deeper well and a pump in their front lot. Many of the North Shore places replaced older ones or were built on empty lots back in the 50s. Now, the Ford place now is, they don't have their flag up to help me identify it, but I believe it's the gray one with the shutters.
It's the gray one next to the big gray one. See the big
Yeah.
two-story?
Uh-huh.
The one immediately to the right.
Okay. So just past between the great big two-story and the yellowish colored house. That's where the Fords are now.
No, not the yellowish color. They are in the gray one.
Oh, the gray one over here. Okay. I call that one blue. Okay. So that's where they started with their prefabricated house from Ball State, which we heard later on was actually originally from a military base somewhere. Ford's neighbor, Mr. Fox, was on the lake for years before they arrived, and he told them he paid $35 for the front lot and $25 for back lots. And when they arrived, lots were going for around $250. So people really didn't get rich from selling lake property back then. The Fords remember frog gigging and turtle hunting in a little pond back behind the road on the North Shore. At that time, the lake was considered too small to ski. Fishing was the pastime. The Ford family, who owns cottages here, say we should ask their sister Barb about the boat motor lost as she and two friends were traveling on their way to Redwater when it slipped off the back of the boat because Barb had not tightened it enough. By the time Tom, Barb, Bill, and Dave Ford were teenagers, presumably about 1945 or 64 to 65, the state laws changed so that the channels in the lake were counted as lake acreage, so skiing was allowed. The previous 10-mile-an-hour speed limit on the lake became a thing of the past, and fishermen had to watch out for speedboats and skiers. I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about the courtesy law, or the gentleman's agreement, but I want to point out to you the place that we're going to tour today, and that is this little home right in front of us with the little banister, the white little banister on it. Two trees, yep. This belongs to Robert and Jennifer Boney, and has been partially restored. It is actually kind of like, still has some of the charm of the original fishing cottage from Hobbs Cabins. This is now in Sycamore Grove. This is the beginning of Sycamore Grove, the end of the Sherman edition. And these guys have done a lot of work to this home, which was one of the oldest homes on the lake. They were built in the late 30s, early 40s. And like I said, it was Hobbs Fishing Village. Original cottages like the Bonies were rustic, having no drywall, containing telephone pole cross beams for studs, complete with the creosote odor, if you can imagine living with that, bare live wires in the walls, added bathrooms, which were plumbing nightmares, and added showers in the bedrooms. Several cottages had only privies. The renters here enjoyed the great fishing, though, and stories of some spearing even 40-inch carp, which is hard for us to imagine on the lake today. Never even seen a carp. There was a grocery store on the Indiana side near the curve. We're going to point out to you where that was in just a few minutes. And people from even other parts of the lake remember an elderly lady selling penny candy, carefully placing each piece in a bag for visiting children and their parents as purchases were made. A picture of the owners of Hobbs Resort, whose real name was Hobbalusa, not Hobbs, is on the posters that advertise this Reflections event. The cottage they stand in front of in our poster was built in 1938 and now belongs to Mr. Hadley. And you can see it right here with the pillars on the front. It doesn't look anything like the original house built in 1938. Probably the only identifying mark might be the chimney. Now, in back of that house, there was a store, the candy store, a little grocery store. And that's the one that people were talking about in their memories. And when you come to the program afterwards where we have the dinner, we'll show you a picture of that store then and now, what it looks like. Okay. So you'll see just a few cottages in this area that sort of look like the original. Most of them have been totally rebuilt. There's a orange one up ahead. This light blue one was one of the original, but it's obviously been added on to. It's much bigger than the little cottages that Hobbs had. This is the oldest section on the lake, first developed. Mm-hmm. I think you'll be able to identify the early cottages up here. There's a blue one and an orange one, and they look very much like they would have looked when they were part of Hobbs Resort. Now we're approaching an area where if we could go straight through the wetlands, we would come to the dam. And I'm just curious, anybody on this boat ever been back to the dam? A couple of you have been back there. How did you get back there when you went back to the dam?
We went by canoe, and I've also walked.
Okay. How about you? How'd you get back there?
We took a paddle boat back there.
Okay. Someone actually told me that years and years ago they took a pontoon boat, which is, I never saw it that wide, but I guess that you could actually get back there down the outlet in a regular boat. My family took kayaks mostly. We took a little motorboat back in the early 70s. We were back to that area. We took our kids back. And we mostly used it for photography, photographing nature. Around the mid-1980s, you're going to have to excuse me if I read from the script for this, because there's so much information in the history that was written for us by Larry Bandelier that I don't want to miss anything. Most of us that live on the lake or are familiar with the lake didn't even know all the details of the development of the dam, so I'm going to read it for you. Around the mid-1980s, during the annual Property Owners Association meeting, a local property owner, Al Dininger, interrupted the meeting. All excited, he said, something's got to be done before the properties on 450 West are flooded. We had had a very rainy spring that year. He was asking for volunteers to cut through the reeds and cattails on the northwest side of the lake and make a channel to a creek in Michigan. Now, the dam at the end of that channel now is back behind those trees. Straight back that way is where the dam is now. Okay? You will, as I'm reading, you're going to see, I'm not going to show you the outlet, the way to get into that dam or how the water, where the water flows out of, until you'll see it's a long ways. This channel's a long channel that we're reading about. Okay, this would allow the water to get away faster since it wouldn't be slowed by cattails. At this time, there was no outlet from the lake except through the wetlands. Several people with shovels and gas-powered tools volunteered and cut this channel. We don't really have a record of how long it took them. We do know it was done without any permits or permission from either Indiana or Michigan DNR. Soon the water level of the lake began dropping. However, the channel they dug allowed the lake to drop lower than anyone intended, and it kept dropping, making it difficult for many to get their boats away from their docks. As memory serves Larry, he's the one that wrote it, the channel was about 3 feet deep due to the fact that the cattails were actually floating above the surface of the lake bottom. When they were removed, the water had no buffer to keep from draining the lake down to that level. Well, of course, that created a problem. The owner of Manipogo Campground, Darrell Dafford, was concerned about the safety of those that were swimming and diving from the swim platform at the campground beach that we'll be looking at in a little bit. He petitioned the Michigan DNR for a permit to construct a temporary dam structure in the channel in order to stop the outflow. Since he owned the property in Michigan through which the channel had been cut, Michigan granted him the permit. He then asked for volunteers to haul sandbags filled with sand and concrete mix to stack in the channel in order to stop the outflow of lake water. Around 8 to 10 men and boys spent 5 to 6 hours filling the bags, transporting them to the site, stacking the bags, and securing them with reinforcing steel bars. The dam height was brought up to the base level of the surrounding cattails. The water soaked through the bags, mixed with the concrete, and created a solid structure. Soon news of the dam spread. Someone notified the Indiana DNR and told them that the campground owner had illegally built a dam on the lake. Without checking with the campground owner, a member of the Indiana DNR trespassed onto the Michigan property and using dynamite blew up the dam. After that, the Lake Association, along with the campground owner, proposed a permanent channel with a permanent dam to control the lake level. A straight route from Prairie Creek in Michigan to the main body of Lake Pleasant through the cattails and solid land was proposed. This would go through both Indiana and Michigan properties. However, the Indiana landowner refused to allow the channel through his property. The Michigan property owner, who was also the campground owner, donated his land for the project. However, this required a channel over 1/2 mile in length. We're still going past it, parallel to it. 1/2 mile in length to be dug so that it could remain entirely on his property. And it's this 1/2 mile channel that my family remembers going down in a motorboat and then eventually a kayak to take pictures, especially. One of the pictures that we took, that my son took when he was about 15, will be shown at the dinner after at the program. He won the best of show at the Ohio State Fair with that in 1992. The channel was done at a much greater expense to the Lake Association members than if it could have used the Indiana property. After the channel was dug, a large steel culvert pipe was placed in the channel so the water flowed through it. Then a steel plate was welded across the front of the culvert to act as a permanent water level control point. The lake level was arrived at by a consensus of property owners in the Indiana DNR. The permanent lake level was officially established on April 11, 1986 by the Steuben County Circuit Court at 961.5 feet above sea level. This worked well for a couple of years until one winter the ice built up in front of the culvert and pushed it away. This created quite an emergency as the lake level quickly dropped. Permits for another dam were received from Michigan, and the money was loaned to the association for the project, interest-free, by one of the lake's property owners. This new dam was entirely made from 2 rows of steel pilings driven in rows 2 feet apart and filled in between with concrete. The sides of the dam extended several feet away from both sides of the channel into solid ground. This structure has remained since January 1990. It has required work from many volunteers over the past several years to keep beavers from preventing the water from flowing over the dam. We are very soon approaching the outlet. We had it marked by a flag, and I think someone took our flag. If you can see the brown, there's a little patch of brown land between where the cattails and the reeds are taller over here. That's where the outlet is. You can go in there, and you could, at one time, take your kayak or whatever back all the way down the channel, but now it's all clogged over with weeds. And there have been, just in this last week, signs have been posted, and absolutely no one is allowed to go to the dam anymore. They can't even clean the beaver debris. That just happened this past week. So that if at some point the lake level becomes higher than the established level, the DNR will have to come in and take care of it. Property owner posted signs. Okay. Yeah, I heard somebody say sandbar. We are going across the sandbar. Yeah, we're on it now. This is kind of the gathering place in the summertime. A lot of boats gather out here and kind of socialize and swim a little bit. And what's really funny is in the winter, my husband took pictures. It looks just like the summer with shanties, ice fishing shanties. When the ice is thick enough, there's so many shanties out here, it looks like sandbar party time. You'll see all this undeveloped land, and that's what really attracts a lot of people to the lake. We have a lot of undeveloped natural beauty. It's very peaceful. And this was actually mentioned by the developer of the railroad in the 1900s. He was developing a railroad to come from South Bend and Elkhart to Angola to Lake Pleasant. He wanted people from the city to be able to see the natural beauty of lakes like Lake Pleasant. And you can still see traces of the railroad behind Bunch's grocery store, Orland. If the weather's just right, Jeannie Whitcomb, a local historian, told me that there's still tracks visible where the railroad was. Have any of you ever heard of Jeannie Whitcomb? She's helping the Orland Fire Department get the equipment they need to take care of our safety on the lake. She has tons and tons of history. It was really interesting talking to her. We're actually on our way to Redwater. I mentioned Redwater with the Ford girl that lost her boat motor, fell off on the way to Redwater. This is just a very undeveloped, totally undeveloped area of our lake with its own name that's existed even before Lake Pleasant. This was on the map. And there's actually an Indian mound back here. We can't show it to you. The lady that owns the, we have heard that there was a tragic accident back there where her son was killed. And this is very personal property to her. And I can understand she doesn't want people coming in and kind of foraging around and trying to find Indian artifacts. There were some people that doubted about the Indian mound, but this story was corroborated by some history that came in right before, only like a week before we had this program. And there actually were Potawatomi Indians. You'll be hearing about them at the dinner too. Potawatomi Indians. We named the chief, and there was. We know that they were back here now because there's actually a story out of a paper that tells about the Indians that live back here and a little incident. I'm gonna save that for you for the dinner. You find out about that stuff later on. Anybody here? I don't know if you guys realize that our little lake, Lake Pleasant, is one of only 3 lakes that are partially in Indiana and partially in Michigan. Do you know what the other 2 lakes are that are partially in Indiana and partially in Michigan?
Lake George.
Lake George is the other smaller one. What's another one? Big lake.
Lake Michigan.
Lake Michigan, good. Lake Michigan and Lake George. Lake of those 3, only Lake George and Lake Pleasant are small enough to qualify if they chose to establish skiing hours. We could actually make an enforceable law on our lake that says skiers may ski from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Now, I told you earlier I was going to ask you about the gentleman's agreement or the courtesy law. Anybody here ever hear of that on our lake? Yeah, you guys have, okay. I remember it well because our family was renting in the early 70s on the East End, and the courtesy law, the gentleman's agreement, said that skiers could only ski from, I believe it was 10 to 5. But it was nice for fishermen because you had the lake to yourself, and then when the skiers wanted to come out, you know, it was about the time of day they usually would ski anyway, but that doesn't exist anymore. Now you kind of have to you know, fight around the skiers. They come out whenever they want to, even up to sundown, and the law says they can actually ski after sundown. Yeah, I doubt it. Yeah. Okay, this portion of our lake is entirely in Michigan, and it's been called Redwater, like I said, since before Lake Pleasant was even named. Does anybody here know why it's called Redwater? Yes?
Because of the tannins in the water.
Okay, what's tannins?
Tannins are chemicals that come from the leaves of the trees and so forth. They get in the water. Water is brownish. When the sun shines on it, it glows bright red. Makes the water look like it's red.
And we got a letter from a 96-year-old gentleman, again, just about a week before the program, that told us that in the 1930s, he and his cronies used to come back here and go turtle hunting, and they would get the turtles for food and sell them for food. I thought that was kind of interesting. We almost always see, in fact, if you look now, there's even some turtles along the side as you're coming back this way. They'll set out and sit in the sun. Mrs. Pashon, who owns the property that told us about the Indian Mound, also said there's a giant oak tree back here. And there have been artifacts found in this area from even earlier groups of Native Americans than the Potawatomis. Some believe as far back as the Ice Ages. They found some really, really old ones. And some of those were a little bit south of here. I know a friend of mine told me about some of these even before we were doing the history for the lake. It was a very, very beautiful little area to come back here and just be quiet. Some people like to fish back here. My family likes to just come back and enjoy the beauty, especially in the fall. It's really pretty back here. Anybody have any questions?
This is a separate lake. It actually is a separate lake.
That's that was my understanding, and that's what it shows on the map too, because it is Redwater Lake and Lake Pleasant.
It's always been called Redwater Lake.
And that, in fact, the question has often come up with whether you can fish. Like if you need a Michigan license. Now, we were told that wherever you have your boat registered, if you have it registered in Michigan, you need a Michigan license, and that's where you fish. And if you have it registered in Indiana, you fish with an Indiana license, and you're okay either way as long as
reciprocal agreement.
right. That's what we were told.
You have to follow the rules
Of the
state
of
where you exit the water.
okay. So
If you leave in Indiana,
uh,
leave the lake in Indiana, you have obeyed the Indiana laws.
and that's the only way you can get in and out of the lake. So it's Indiana laws because you can't get in here in Michigan. I just think it's beautiful back here. The willow trees. This lake used to have lots more willow trees on it than we see now. We'll show you a part later on the east end that was just so thick with willow trees you couldn't even see the cottages. Our resident swans were staying back here quite a bit earlier this year. We would come back here and we would often pass them resting. We assume that their nest is inside the thicker cattails because we'd see the swan feathers, and they would be lying there just resting as we came by. It was kind of a treat when they still had their 3 babies. Now there's only 1 left. We don't know what happened to them, but you might even be able to still see some feathers or some indentation where they were, but I'm not sure. Yeah, that's where they were. You can sort of see a little hollow there. I'm not seeing too many. Yeah, maybe a little bit of feathers back in there. Their nests are huge. There's a swan feather. We watched 2 years ago. We watched mother sit on a nest back on the other side of the lake, and it's just mammoth, huge nest. They were sitting there a long, long time. We often see the sandhill cranes or hear the sandhill cranes back in this area of the lake. They used to be very rare, but now they're pretty common, and they're kind of interesting to watch the way they dance and court each other, and they make such an interesting call. So we see the sandhill cranes, the swans, herons. There was a heron that was often perched in the tree over there. They look so funny when they're in a tree. They're so big, such a big bird to be perched up on the top of a tree. We do have to go in and out of Redwater at idle speed. When we get out back to the lake, we're going to pick up the pace a little bit. We'll pick up the pace as we get past the idle speed law. And I just wanted to tell you that somewhere over on the opposite end from where we are now, they say there's a fence in the lake. We haven't been able, yeah, there's one over here too, but we haven't ever been able to get a really good shot of it. But the owner of the campground now told me that at one time the lake was smaller. It is kind of, the land is eroded around the edge of the lake, and it has actually crept in onto what was originally farmland. And so some of those the fences that have been spotted are probably fences that were submerged as the ground eroded and the lake moved over. He said 120 feet, but there was quite a few people that didn't think it had eroded and gone in that far, but kind of hard to measure distance that when you're just looking at what it looks like. This part of the lake is one of our favorite fishing spots, down on this end, the west end. Even if we don't catch any fish, it's always so pretty.
What kind of fish do they catch in this lake?
Oh, good question. We catch bluegill, crappie, bass, some perch, although not as many as we used to. There are pike. There's a lot of sporting fishermen that like to catch the great big pike or the great big bass. I'm trying to think what else. There's a rock bass, they call it, but that's pretty much it. There are gar too, and occasionally a catfish or a bullhead. We haven't seen very many of those at all in the last few years. Used to catch quite a few of those little bullheads or catfish. I remember my stepdad catching them, going fishing specifically for them. So I'm not quite sure why the population has changed for the catfish, but the Lake Association is actually doing something about the perch and the bass by putting fish attractors in the lake this year. We're going to try to get the population of perch to increase. Okay, we're going to buzz across the west end, even though I love taking the time. It's so pretty. We're going to go over to our next development, which is called Sellers Shady Shores. We often see deer over on this end. They'll come out and kind of frisk around in the water. And I'm going to ask our driver to go especially slow past Sellers because of a lot of history. And it's hard to get it all in. I can't talk that fast. Yeah, there is kind of a lot in this next area.
Talking all about the channels being made.
Okay, as I told you, the next area on the lake is Sellers Shady Shores. And this was developed by Kenneth Sellers in the early 1950s. Between 1953 and 1956, the channels were dug. He dug the channels so that he could build up some land to build on, to kind of develop the area for cottages. Okay, these were the channels that led to the changing of the speed limit because the state decided that we could allow that as part of the acreage of the lake, and that made the lake big enough to allow for skiing. So if he had not dug the channels, he developed the land because the turnpike had divided his farm. Mr. Sellers then also built the marina. I ought to tell you, his daughter-in-law, Lila Sellers, is a friend of mine, and she told me that his dream was for each member of his family to have a cottage back here. But they were farmers, and they just didn't have the time to really enjoy the lake. And so really, there's none of them left here. Lila lives over on Lake Gage, and of course, it would have been her husband that would have been his son. Okay, so here's the first channel. There are 3, I believe, that he dug, and then we'll talk about the T channel when we get there. He also built the marina to service Lake Pleasant residents and their boating needs. We'll be able to see the marina just before we get to the dark blue cottage. If you look straight down that channel, you'll see the marina. Mr. Floyd Yarrington bought that marina in about 1971 and added basic grocery items with candy, ice cream, pop, and beer. Okay, and the children really love this guy. I guess they'd go down to buy candy, and they would want something that cost a dime, and they'd have 6 cents. And Mr. Wilson, that lives over here, said he would always tell them they had just the right amount of money. He could remember Mr. Yarrington, whose daughter still has a place just down the way a little bit. Okay, so we're going to look down the channel just before the blue cottage, and you should be able to see the marina, which was purchased then in 1996 by Steve Daler. And he still runs it today with his son, Tracy. There are no groceries or anything there anymore. It's just marine stuff and gas. Kenneth Sellers,
Great.
yeah, and a great mechanic, right? They fix the boats, they sell the boats, they fix the boats, and they sell the gas. Okay, so look straight down that channel. You'll see the marina at the end. And then we're going to go to the next channel where if we look straight down the channel, we will see the original place owned by Kenneth Sellers. It's a cottage now owned by Dan Cole. And he built 2 other cottages that were rented out at the time that he was here, now owned by Keith Hope and Tony Eagle. Just past the yellow cottage, look down the channel, and you'll see a house with a blue peak and some ceramic fish on it, and that is the original Sellers place. These are the shutters. You can see it from here already. Okay, that's now owned by my brother, actually, Dan Cole. And the little yellow one is my mom. So just like I said, we got families that are kind of gathered around the lake. Okay, Mr. Sellers and his family graciously donated this beach area to Sellers Shady Shores Association to be used and protected by the property owners here. Cottage owners in the early Sellers years had annual volleyball tournaments, a tradition that was carried on for many years. Today, the association hosts an annual picnic with hot dogs and other food and provides children's games, and of late, a cornhole tournament for all to enjoy. Mr. Sellers had, most of the channels dug so that the land could be supplied for cottages, but one channel, this T channel right here ahead of us, was dug by the property owners just south of it. And that was dug so that they could drain the boggy area and cut down on mosquitoes. Interesting memories, which are just that because of changes, include a dance floor. There usually be a dance floor back in that area where sock hops were held, a shuffleboard court to the south and east of Coles, and a diving board and a slide on the beach, placed there by some of the original families in the Sellers addition. You'll be seeing some pictures of those things at the dinner. The cement base of the diving board was just removed within the last 2 years. We are told there was even a high dive made from a windmill, and that the cottage owners dug out the area under the board, which is now a fishing hole, accessible from the shore. Somebody had a question. Somebody had a question about people living here. Oh, she asked me how many people live on the lake year-round. I'm not sure of the exact number, but it's somewhere less than 40% that claim it as their residence. But many of those people go to Florida, you know, they claim it as their residence, but they don't really stay here. So wintertime is really quiet, which my husband loves. He likes it quiet. It's pretty nice. This next section I have no history on, and I'm sorry I didn't get any research turned in for Gilchrist, just a very small section. I heard a rumor that it was once part of the campground. I don't know if that's true, that it was sold off the campground or not, but it is not part of Sellers. Manipogo Campground coming up, where you see the flags, which I've been told, by the way, are very effective to get rid of the geese from coming up on the land. I don't know if you guys had heard that, but those flags actually do keep the geese off the ground. They were telling us that the other day. It was originally established in 1965 and owned by Lance Dafford's father, Darrell Dafford. He started it with only 10 campsites and 1 water spigot. How many campsites do you think there are now? Anybody have a guess? 305. I think that lady knows this lake. It is now owned by Mr. and Mrs. John West. Don Gillespie and Paul Baldwin, who have been on the lake for more than 50 years, remember boating past the woods where there were just a few campers and hearing the shots of people squirrel hunting there long ago. Only 9 horsepower motors were allowed on the lake in those days. Remember, we said before they started the skiing and everything. Most of the campsites there now are seasonal. Many families are there as often as the cottage owners are. West and their staff have made many contributions to help LPHOA, including helping with weed control and our annual fireworks, as well as helping with ongoing dam cleanup, trash pickup, and fish attractors projects. There was a lot of resistance to the campground when it first came. I remember people being very upset. Didn't want the transient, all the extra boats, but I will say that they have brought some good, to the lake. So,
Can anyone use their beach?
no, it is a private beach, and they monitor who goes in and out. Now, when it's really, really quiet, and there's no campers, not very many campers around, those of us that live nearby have been given permission. The kids have been allowed to come over and play, on the playground. But that's just kind of because we're here all the time and they know us. And if there's not that many campers, they'll let us come over. But
Are the campsites in the front, are they on leases or something? Are they the same people year after year?
yeah, it's almost all of it is seasonal. Very few people come in and just camp for a weekend or something. And if you have a tent, they put you clear out by the turnpike. So these places are like homes. You go back there and they've got decks and flowers, and they're pretty nice, actually.
Years ago, my brother used to have a tent, and really they were where these.
Yeah, 'cause before it was developed, yeah. They let us use the pavilion for a little club that we have for the Bible Club, and then they also have a breakfast every year. And they do all the work, buy all the supplies, and donate all the proceeds to the Orland Fire Department. Okay, fishing is good in this next undeveloped part of the lake. And for the adventurous, boats can carefully maneuver through the reeds and cattails to find what some families call the marl pit. Others entertain their children with the idea of a monster pit. That's what we always called it when the kids were growing up, since it's very isolated. You, I think, can see the entrance to it if you look back through the cattails. There's no flag over there. But marl was mined from most of the area lakes around here and used for various purposes. Dan Schoenbein from the East End years ago said it was used to make gunpowder. But the local historian I talked about, that Jeannie Whitcomb, she said it was used perhaps also for an alternative to lime. Okay, we're approaching the Collins edition. Frank Collins originally owned the farm he developed into lake property, now called the Collins edition. Again, after the turnpike was finished, about 1954. This was his farm, okay? He sold the lots for $500 between the end of the 50s and the early 1960s. There's a cutout, if you can really slow your boat down. There's a cutout there, and that's where Gerald Daphorn began to dig a channel so he could flood the lake water into it and then build a trailer park on the surrounding property. However, neighbors there did not want this and went to court to stop the development. Now, back to talking about Frank Collins. Ron Spade, some of you know him because he delivers stone, and he's a retired DNR guy who lives on the east end of this lake, is Frank's grandson, and he still lives down that way. And he tells about denizens and another neighbor digging the channel in front of their places through the ice. Okay, placing the dirt on the high spot that has now become an island down here. That island is not natural.
That other person was Eam.
Stan Eam.
Stan Eam, yeah.
Okay. They dug through the ice and they placed the dirt on the high spot, and then Ron's brother Herbert lived in Orland when they did this. Well, when his grandfather was selling the lots, and he told him, you better buy a lot or you're going to be too late. And so he bought the last lot, which is now Beams?
Yeah, back that way.
Down there, and he built kind of a shack, kind of a building, and it was on skids, and he put it on that last lot Well, he got away with that for a while. It wasn't legal, but the DNR let him, the county people let him do it because there were other people living in a well house. But they got rowdy and had some big parties and stuff. And eventually he came home one day to find out that there was a red notice that he could no longer live there. However, they moved that building to behind the A-frame, this gray A-frame, and it's now a garden shed. So it's still there. We just found that out fairly recently.
Take some pictures of that.
No, we didn't.
Oh, it's got some beautiful flowers painted on the side. She did a nice job.
Yeah, we didn't learn about it
Yeah,
at the
that-
time.
Little
Okay.
A-frame, that shed in front, is that where the rowdy people were at?
Could
No.
be. I don't know.
Probably so. You're right.
Yeah, that was Stan and Jackie.
Give Jackie and Stan the credit for that one.
Yeah. Okay, that house right there is Chris Yesh's, the great big house with the peak, and that house burned down. And I didn't find out what year. It was just within the last 10 years,
Oh, yeah.
maybe 5 years even. Burned
Do you
clear
know
down.
which one she's talking
And we'll
about?
be talking about that a little bit and showing you some pictures. The blue cottage ahead of us on the little peninsula was owned originally by 2 priests and is the last cottage in the Collins addition. It was also the first cottage built south of the Willows, okay, when the Willows Resort, which is what we're coming to next. South of the Willows.
So,
Did I-
yeah, north.
That doesn't surprise me. I
There
know
is-
that's a direction with
And there is another channel just on the other side of that blue cottage.
Really?
Yes, there is. Goes back there about where those trees are, where the blue pontoon's at, on the other side.
Is
of the
that
channel.
the second one they dug? Because I
Maybe.
misunderstood and thought it was that way, but
It may be. I don't know. It's been there for as long as I've been here. That's there almost
Yeah,
30
because he
years.
said they dug the one and then they dug another one, and I had just to the west. Okay, the group of cottages around this little private beach ahead is known as the Willow. Was known as the Willows. Was
To the left.
almost, yeah, to the left. We're not quite there yet, but this whole area we refer to as the Willows. It was originally almost totally hidden by willow trees. Now I don't even know if they refer to it as the Willows anymore. It's now owned by Roseanne and Shirley Hallman. The property was originally part of a 92 and 2800 acres purchased in 1835 for $300. 2 and 400 acres of that property was later passed through various owners. Then Dan and Sue Schoenbein bought it from a Mr. Paul in 1955 for $8,000. They built the Willows Resort and were dearly loved by many association members who once rented there, but now have places of our own. Sue probably taught close to 50 to 70 children to swim, while Dan kept them in line because he had this kind of rough demeanor. But then he'd help Sue slip candy into the bags when we were getting ready to leave.
Yep.
Paul Baldwin, 90 years old, was one of the people who rented from Dan and Sue, and even before them from
So did I.
Mr. Paul. Did you? We did too. A whole bunch of us did.
Yep.
Okay. Paul tells of a reddish-colored cottage that's no longer there. It was down close to the water. It used to be an ice house, and it was insulated with sawdust. His family didn't like renting it very much because of all the mice that were attracted to it. Okay. Later, that Baldwin's rented a big 2-story cottage for $30 a week, which was too much. So they went together with another family. And this was for a cottage that didn't have any indoor plumbing. And they had to wash all their clothes in the spring, including the baby diapers. There was like an artesian well over there. And then they'd hang them up on the clothesline. Okay, so from that time when they rented that 2-story cottage and had to hang all their laundry out, within the next 10 to 12 years, he saw a cabin built on this end of the lake for sale for, what do you think? What do you think a house sold for back in about 1960?
$10,000.
$5,000. You remember seeing a cottage for $5,000. Sue Schoenbein's sister, Erna, lived at the Willows with her husband, Walt. And she sent us photos and slides from Dan and Sue's days at the Willows for our pictorial history later this evening. These cottages are now owned by Roseanne and Shirley Hallman and are still being rented for vacation weeks by descendants and friends of some of the vacationers of early years. So interesting, the story about the 30s that we got after we put the program together. that there was a restaurant back there that was referenced as a speakeasy. I wish we would have gotten some of the information that we got in the last few days in time to put it into the script. But I'm not sure. I could have found that out. I didn't ask. She asked me what they rent for now, but I'm fairly confident it's not more than 300. I think they kept it down. They're still kind of rustic, you know. It's
Probably not 55.
no, not 55. And someone pointed out that the lots that we were talking about that were sold for like $35 and $20, the lots now that were for sale that I pointed out at the beginning are more like $200,000 just for the lot, the bare lot. Okay, we can go on to our stopping point. Anybody have any questions about the Willows? This is where I started on this lake, and so it's kind of dear to me. The people were pretty special to us.
And a lot of people that have cottages now on the lake and other areas started there.
Yeah, every time I talked, even when we were getting ready for the program, one of the other docents, I was talking about this, he says, we started down there. I go, really? You know, quite a few people that helped organize the program for Reflections actually got their start down at the Willows. Okay. Anybody in this boat ever ran at the Willows? Nope. Bandoliers did, yeah. Tom Stillwell said he did. Down where we live now, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, at least five that places that are owned that started out down here. And we're going to pause here by this house with a pretty green roof. And we're going to stop just a minute, and I'm going to have you look back at what we just saw at the Willows and the Collins. And all of this area was completely destroyed by the largest tornado ever to hit Indiana. In 1965 on Palm Sunday, it wreaked destruction over 20 miles in a 3-hour time period on Palm Sunday. Sadly, Dan and Sue Schoenbein, who had the Willows, had just paid off the mortgage in 1964. It was less than a year before that tornado hit and completely destroyed everything they had, and they had no insurance because they had paid off their mortgage. You're going to be seeing some pretty dramatic pictures of the tornado damage. I'm going to tell you a little anecdotal story that I heard from the Sellers family about the tornado. They were, if you remember, the Sellers was down there where the beach was. Mr. Sellers lived in a great big house on a hill, and the family during this horrible tornado tried to get down to their storm cellar. They couldn't get down there, and they were blown out of the house. The only person hurt was a child who broke an arm, and later on they went back to check out the damage, and that cellar, storm cellar where they were trying to escape, was completely filled with a turned over silo that was full of corn and grain, and it would have smothered them. If they'd have gotten to their storm cellar, they'd have been killed. And the only damage that they had was a child injured. They lost the house, it completely blew away, but that one child was injured, and that was it. And I'm not even sure I'll remember to tell that story again.
Where did they go, though? How did they weren't in the house?
They were in the house. They got blown out of the house. Yeah, and then that's how the child broke their arm. But, you know, had they gotten to the storm cellar, they would have been killed. So there are lots and lots of memories we'll share at our dinner. Some pretty amazing stories of what happened during that tornado, but pretty sad. It's kind of hard for me to even read some of the things that we have at the dinner without crying, because I knew the people, and it was really, really, really tragic. Pardon?
That half a willow that's still standing.
Uh-huh.
That's Don Gillespie's house.
Oh, okay, yeah, and that's Don Gillespie's house, and we're actually I didn't realize that was in his house. Is it in his yard where that willow went down?
Across this side.
Across the street. Okay, we're going to be talking about Don Gillespie. He is the man who lives in the house behind the willow that came apart. Gave us quite a bit of history and was going to be one of our docents on this tour, but sadly his mother got very ill at the last minute and passed away, and he wasn't able to come on the trip. But his grandfather was one of the first residents that we know of on this end of the lake. 1945, he had been fishing on Lake George for many years and was attracted to Lake Pleasant by its outstanding sunsets. That influenced his hobby of photography and led to the purchase of a lot. In about 1948, Don's Grandpa John and two neighbors had dredging done in front of their lots, then used the material dredged to fill in the front lots from that road to the lake. John fished Lake Pleasant and also Hog Lake, which is now Barton Lake, and at that time had an island and no cottages on it. He had 6 two-hold boats built while he was managing Portland Lumber and Supply in Portland, Indiana, using 3/4-inch cedar wood, making them very heavy, but stable for fishing. And as a boy, Don got the chore of filling and soaking the boats that John kept at Lake Pleasant with water at the end of the weekend so that it would not shrink. And then when the family returned the next time, he had to bail the water out so the boat could be used. During the tornado, 2 of the hauled boats were driven into trees back on Hog Lake. Don also told us of a creature found in the lake which was identified by a biologist as a lamprey eel. Now, do you think that was native to our lake? A lamprey eel? So we wonder where it came from or if the biologist knew what he was talking about. We'll show you a picture of that eel at the dinner. Okay, we wanted to point out the blue cottage over there. You can see it real easily, the bright blue or kind of a deep blue. That was once 2 cottages that were combined to make 1 cottage. And then we also have some stories about, see where the brown cottage is down there? There's the last cottage next to that one. There were all kinds of rumors about this place, and we actually got some of them confirmed by a letter that came from that professor. First we had heard it was a turnpike booth, and then it looked like it was a front porch and a back porch with 2 bedrooms in the middle. And there was a rumor that beer was sold out to people traveling by on the road from the back porch. Well, this professor sent us a letter and said it actually there were 2 bootleggers that lived over here in the 30s. One was there, and one was approximately where that blue house is, because he said 2 houses south of it. Okay, and he actually drank illegal brew at that place that was called Dad Chambers. The guy was Dad Chambers. He was 15 years old. This professor was 96 who wrote the letter. So 81 years ago, he was drinking illegal brew from Dad Chambers, one of the bootleggers that lived in that little house. Okay, and that is about the history of this section. So we're going to be going back to the Boney residence. And as we go back to our starting point, I want you to kind of look between the houses and you'll see a ridge, kind of a ridge in back of the houses. This was the result of dirt being pulled down to the edge of the lake to fill in what was once boggy ground and later became usable lakefront property. Can you see the ridge back there? You can kind of between the houses, okay? So at this point, I want to say thank you to all of the Lake Pleasant Homeowners Association people who shared facts and photos and special memories to help appreciate the history of Lake Pleasant. And thanks to you guys for coming today. And also special thanks to Bob and Jennifer Boney. I know you guys enjoyed the house tour. That was really a treat. And, you know, considerable sacrifice for a family with small children to let people come through their house. Everybody that participated in the program, we hope you enjoyed your boat tour and that you'll enjoy the pictorial history and the dinner that's going to be following at the Little Orland Congregational Church. It's right on State Route 120 as you go into Orland, about a block past the Dollar General store and on the left side of the road.